Imagine dust, the ancient dust that settles on your fingers when you touch a shard of pottery that has been in the ground for 4,500 years. In that dust is the memory of the people who once walked the cobbled streets, filled water jugs, and lit the lamps in their homes. And now, imagine that this dust holds a secret so incredible that even in our time, when we have split the atom and traveled to the moon, it makes us freeze in bewilderment and ask ourselves, what if everything was not as we thought? Greetings, my dear listeners. Today, we are going on a journey to the ruins of a mysterious city, where archaeology meets legend, where the scientific method meets ancient texts, and where cold facts are intertwined with hypotheses so incredible that they seem the product of the most daring imagination. Write in the comments what city you're from and what time it is. I'd be interested to know where in the world you're listening to this story of mysteries hidden in the Pakistani desert, Mohenjo-Daro. Even the very name of this place sounds like an incantation, like the whisper of the wind passing between ancient ruins. Hill of the Dead is how the name translates from the Sindhi language. What a grim, what a poignant name for a city that was once the jewel of a civilization that flourished on the banks of the Indus, when the pyramids of Egypt were still under construction, and the first kings of Sumer ruled Mesopotamia. Imagine a morning 2,600 years before our era. The sun rises over the wide Indus Valley, its rays sliding down the neatly laid brick walls, reflected in the water of the canals that, like blood vessels, permeate the entire city. In the houses, people are waking up, men and women whose faces we will never see, whose names have vanished forever into time. They washed themselves with clean water from clay vessels, dressed in fabrics dyed in colors whose recipes have been lost, and took to the streets of a city whose layout was so perfect that even today's urban planners would envy it. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro were laid out with mathematical precision, strictly north-south, west-east, as if the whole city were laid out on a giant grid. The houses were built of burnt brick, an expensive and fuel-intensive material, but durable. Each neighborhood had its own wells, each house its own drainage system. Mohenjo-Daro's sewerage system was so sophisticated that modern inhabitants of India and Pakistan could only dream of a similar level of urban management. Archaeologist Rakaldas Banerjee could not have imagined, when he uncovered the first bricks of this city in the year 1922, that he held the key to one of the greatest mysteries of antiquity. He was excavating just another archaeological monument, but with every day of work, With every new layer of earth his workers removed, it became clear this was not just an ancient city. It was evidence of the existence of an entire civilization about which history knew almost nothing. The Indus Valley Civilization, or Harappan civilization as it came to be known to scholars, extended over an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It flourished at a time when people in Europe were still living in the Stone Age, and the first dynasties were just emerging in China. And yet, there is not a single deciphered text or written record left of this great civilization that we can understand. Its cities seem to speak to us in the language of stone and clay, of streets and walls, of sewers and jewelry. But the silence of the stones is sometimes more eloquent than the most detailed chronicles. Archaeologists who have worked at Mohenjo-Daro in the decades since its discovery have gradually built up a portrait of a society that is astonishing in its sophistication and puzzling in its mysteries. No grand temples, no lavish palaces or rich tombs of rulers were found here. It seemed that this city was ruled not by a royal dynasty, but by some other form of authority. Perhaps a council of elders, perhaps an elected or clan oligarchy. The equal size of the houses, the absence of obvious signs of social inequality, all this created an image of a society organized according to principles that seem almost modern. And that was the first mystery of Mohenjo-Daro. How could such an advanced civilization have existed without leaving behind any written monuments, monumental art, or traces of religious cults? But even more mysterious was the question of how and why this civilization disappeared. Imagine walking through the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, not as a 21st century tourist, but as an inhabitant of this city in its last days. Perhaps it was in the 17th century BC, or maybe even earlier. We don't know the exact date because we don't have any Harappan annals or any document that tells us about the last days of the city. We can only guess from the mute testimonies left to archaeologists by the last generations of Mohenjo-Daro's inhabitants. This evidence suggests that the city died slowly. In the later layers of excavations, archaeologists find signs of decay. The buildings become more dilapidated. Small private houses appear on the ruins of public buildings, and the quality of pottery deteriorates. The impression is that the once prosperous city was gradually turning into a backwater settlement whose inhabitants no longer had the knowledge or resources of their ancestors. But there were also findings in Mohenjo-Daro that painted a very different picture of its demise. In some parts of the city, archaeologists found human skeletons, not buried according to custom, but lying in the streets in strange, unnatural poses, as if death had struck suddenly, giving them no time to even try to escape. Some of these skeletons were found in groups, families who had died together before scattering. What could have caused such a sudden death? An epidemic? But then, why were the bodies not buried? An enemy attack? But why no signs of battle? No scattered weapons? No damage to the bones? An earthquake? Flooding? These hypotheses did not explain all the peculiarities of the findings either. And then, archaeologists noticed another oddity. In some areas of the city, there were pieces of clay and sand which were melted, turned into a kind of glass. The temperature required for such melting should have reached 1,500 degrees centigrade. Where in the ancient city could such hellish temperatures occur? At first, it was thought to be fire damage, but an ordinary fire, even a very strong one, can't create such a temperature in the open air. And the distribution of the melted areas was strange. They were concentrated in certain areas, not randomly scattered all over the city. It was these mysterious findings that led some researchers to believe that Mohenjo-Daro had perished neither from a natural catastrophe nor from the actions of ordinary conquerors. In the 70s of the 20th century, the English archaeologist David Davenport and the Italian journalist Ettore Vincenti put forward a hypothesis that sounded so incredible that many of their colleagues at first simply refused to discuss it. In their opinion, Mohenjo-Daro was destroyed by a nuclear explosion. Nuclear explosion, at a time when people did not yet know iron metallurgy, when the wheel had only just appeared in some parts of the world, when writing was the privilege of a narrow circle of priests and scribes in the temples of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Nuclear explosion. 4,000 years before Enrico Fermi started the world's first nuclear reactor in the basement of the University of Chicago. Sounds like science fiction, doesn't it? But Davenport and Vincenti claimed they had proof. They pointed to the melted areas, to the strange arrangement of human remains, to the fact that the destruction in the city had a clear epicenter, an area about 50 meters in diameter, where buildings were swept away as if by a shock wave, and bricks were melted on one side, indicating the direction of the explosion. But their most sensational claim was that among the human remains found at Mohenjo-Daro were skeletons with elevated levels of radioactivity, about the same as those found in the victims of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If this is true, then the history of mankind needs a radical revision. If 4,500 years ago, someone already possessed nuclear weapons, who was it? Where did the technology come from? And most importantly, where did they disappear to? Proponents of the hypothesis of nuclear war in antiquity did not limit themselves to archaeological data. They also turned to ancient texts, and there they found descriptions that, if desired, could be interpreted as evidence of the use of weapons of unprecedented destructive power. Fragments from the great Indian epic, the Mahabharata, were particularly frequently quoted. In this ancient poem, the creation of which stretched over many centuries, there are descriptions of wars between different kingdoms and tribes, and some of these descriptions are striking in their vividness and detail. It speaks of the iron lightning strike, of a giant messenger of death that turned an entire race to ashes, of a column of smoke and fire that was as bright as 10,000 suns. The effects of these weapons are also described: loss of hair and nails of people, broken crockery, whitewashed birds, contaminated food. Soldiers, according to the text, threw themselves into the water to wash themselves of radiation vapors. Could the authors of the Mahabharata have known about radiation sickness 4,000 years ago? Even more surprising were the descriptions of flying machines, vimanas, on which the heroes of the epic and the gods traveled. These vimanas were depicted as double-decked round flying machines with holes and a dome, capable of ascending and descending vertically and flying at the speed of the wind. The ancient texts even gave technical details of their construction. They mentioned mercury engines, yellow-white liquid as fuel, the use of solar energy, and even anti-gravity. The treatise Samarangana Sutradhara devotes 230 chapters to vimanas, describing their construction, takeoff, landing, and maneuvers in the air. The Vaimanika Shastra, dating from the 4th century BC, describes 31 major parts of the flying machine, 16 materials capable of absorbing light and heat, and a detailed instruction manual. But here, my dear listeners, is where our story takes an unexpected turn, because the most fascinating legends sometimes fall apart when you look closely at their foundation. And the story of the nuclear explosion in ancient Mohenjo-Daro turned out to be just such a legend. Beautiful, fascinating, but built on a foundation of sand. Imagine a detective who unravels an intricate crime step by step, and each new piece of evidence causes him to revise his initial conclusions. That's exactly how scientists worked when they began scrutinizing every claim made by proponents of the ancient nuclear war hypothesis. And what they discovered was as fascinating as the legend itself. It was a story of how myths are born in our time, how one inaccuracy begets another, and how the desire to sensationalize can lead us very far from the truth. Let's start with the most important evidence: those mysterious radioactive skeletons allegedly found in the streets of Mohenjo-Daro. This story has turned out to be like a game of spoilt telephone, with each successive narrator adding something of his own until the original message turns into something completely different. It all started in 1962nd year, when Soviet biophysicists published a paper that mentioned the skeleton of an Egyptian who lived 4,000 years ago. In this skeleton, the level of natural radioactivity was slightly higher than normal, a phenomenon not so rare because the natural radiation background in different places on Earth can vary significantly, especially in areas with deposits of uranium ores or other radioactive minerals. But when this scientific work fell into the hands of popularizers, an amazing transformation took place. One Egyptian skeleton with an elevated natural background of radiation turned first into a radioactive skeleton, then into skeletons from Mohenjo-Daro, and then into hundreds of radioactive remains of nuclear explosion victims. By the time the story reached the general public, it had acquired a level of detail not found in any scientific source. In 2013, the Italian researcher Enrico Baccarini made direct measurements of the radiation background in Mohenjo-Daro using modern instruments. The result was predictable. No excess of normal radiation levels was detected. Moreover, even if there had been a nuclear explosion in ancient times, its radioactive traces would have almost completely disappeared after 4,500 years. The fact is that the main radioactive isotopes produced in a nuclear explosion, cesium-137 and strontium-90, have a half-life of about 30 years. This means that after 30 years, their number is halved. After 60 years, it is quadrupled, and so on. In 4,000 years, there would be no trace of them left. However, there could still be long-lived transuranic elements like plutonium or americium, but these have not yet been found in the Mohenjo-Daro samples. And what about those mysterious melted areas that supposedly testified to the epicenter of the nuclear explosion? And here, archaeologists have found a much more prosaic explanation. What Davenport thought was the epicenter of the explosion was actually the remains of a large clay firing pit. Imagine an ancient master ceramist at work. To make the quality pottery and fired bricks from which all of Mohenjo-Daro was built required temperatures of up to 1,500 degrees centigrade, the exact temperature at which the clay and sand melted. The millions of bricks from which the city was built, the millions of clay vessels, roof tiles, and sewer pipes all required an incredible amount of fuel. Archaeologists estimate that millions of tons of wood were needed to build Mohenjo-Daro alone. Imagine the once verdant hills around the city, covered with forests that were cut down year after year, decade after decade, to meet the needs of the growing city. The smoke from countless kilns rose to the sky, taking with it not only the ash, but also the future of the city itself, because the deforestation of the Indus Valley had disastrous consequences. Without forests, the region's climate changed, less rainfall and more frequent droughts. The soil, stripped of the tree roots that held it to the hillsides, began to wash into the river. The Indus gradually became shallow, silting up and causing more devastating floods. Here it is, the real tragedy of Mohenjo-Daro. Not an instant catastrophe from an unknown weapon, but the slow agony of a civilization that created the conditions for its own demise. It's a story that sounds frighteningly modern, doesn't it? A story of how a prosperous society can destroy the foundations of its own existence in pursuit of short-term gains. The archaeological layers tell us this story with the ruthless precision of a chronicler. In the early layers of Mohenjo-Daro, we see signs of a flourishing civilization. Neatly laid out streets, elaborately made pottery, finely crafted jewelry. In the later layers, the picture changes. Buildings become simpler, ceramics coarser, and small private houses appear on the ruins of public buildings. This is a story of decadence stretching over centuries. Scientists today believe that the Indus Valley civilization perished not from a single catastrophe, but from a whole complex of interrelated causes. Drought caused by deforestation and climate change. Floods made more devastating by the silting up of the river. Perhaps also earthquakes. The area is still seismically active. Trade routes linking the Indus Valley with Mesopotamia and other centers of ancient civilization gradually moved elsewhere. The population of Mohenjo-Daro did not die out overnight. People simply gradually left the city for more favorable locations. But what about those mysterious texts from antiquity that supposedly describe nuclear weapons and flying machines? Here we are in for another disappointment, and at the same time another lesson in the importance of being careful with translations and interpretations of ancient texts. The famous quote about the iron lightning strike and the pillar of fire as bright as 10,000 suns, which is so often cited as evidence of the ancient Indians' familiarity with nuclear weapons, is actually a compilation of various sources, first appearing in the book The Morning of the Magicians by French authors Louis Pauvel and Jacques Bergier in 1960. If we turn to the original text of the Mahabharata, we find that in the corresponding place in the epic, in the Mausala Parva, the story is quite different. It tells of a curse that resulted in the birth of a stick, which was then pulverized into powder and thrown into the ocean. There are no descriptions of nuclear explosions, and the famous phrase, brighter than 1,000 suns, it does occur in ancient Indian texts, but it is a stable poetic formula used to describe divine phenomena. When Krishna shows Arjuna his cosmic form in the Bhagavad Gita, he shines like 1,000 suns rising simultaneously. This is not a description of a weapon. It is a way of conveying the ineffability and grandeur of divine revelation. Imagine an ancient poet trying to find words to describe something that transcends all earthly standards. How do you describe the radiance of a god? How to convey the majesty of cosmic forces? The poet turns to the brightest phenomenon known to him, the sun, and says, imagine not one sun, but 1,000 suns. This is a poetic device, a metaphor, not a technical description of a thermonuclear reaction. The same is true of Vimanas, those mysterious flying machines mentioned in ancient Indian texts. Yes, such descriptions do exist, and some of them are amazing in their detail. But don't forget that Sanskrit literature abounds with fantastic descriptions. The same texts tell of warriors several kilometers tall, of arrows that turn into snakes, of mountains that fly across the sky. Ancient authors did not make such a strict distinction between reality and fantasy as we do. For them, the world was inhabited by gods and demons, magical creatures and magic objects. Vimanas, in this context, are not necessarily real flying machines, but elements of a mythological picture of the world in which gods and heroes naturally possess supernatural powers. In addition, many of the most detailed descriptions of Vimanas are found in texts of rather late origin. The same Vaimanika Shastra, so often cited as an ancient manual on aeronautics, was actually written down only in the 20th century by one Pandit Subharaja Shastri, who claimed to have obtained this knowledge in a state of meditative trance. Modern Sanskritologists consider this text to be a forgery. But even if we set aside the later forgeries and focus only on the truly ancient texts, we must remember how difficult it can be to accurately translate and interpret ancient texts. Sanskrit is an extraordinarily rich and complex language. Many of its words have multiple meanings, and its grammatical structure allows for sentences that can be understood in many different ways. Take, for example, the Sanskrit word Agni. It can be translated as fire, but it is also the name of the god of fire. And in different contexts, it can mean lightning, the sun, sacrificial fire, passion, anger, or even just light. When an ancient poet writes of Agni flying across the sky, it could be a description of lightning, a meteor, a sunbeam, or something else entirely. The history of science is replete with examples of researchers finding in ancient sources confirmation of their own theories, sometimes in a very strained way. The history of science is full of examples of how researchers have found in ancient sources evidence for their own theories, sometimes in very strained ways. But you know what's most interesting? The real story of Mohenjo-Daro, the story of the rise and fall of a great civilization, is no less fascinating than any fantastic legend about nuclear wars in antiquity. Moreover, it is far more instructive to us, the people of the 21st century, because Mohenjo-Daro is a mirror in which we can see ourselves. It is the story of a civilization that achieved incredible heights in urban planning, engineering, social organization, but which failed to find a balance between its needs and the possibilities of the environment. It is a story of how short-term solutions can have long-term, catastrophic consequences. The inhabitants of Mohenjo-Daro were not stupid or short-sighted people. On the contrary, they created one of the most advanced urban civilizations of antiquity. But they lived in a world where the consequences of their actions took decades and centuries to manifest themselves. When the last forests in the hills were cut down, no one could have predicted that it would lead to climate change and droughts. When more and more city blocks were built, no one thought that the growing need for bricks would eventually undermine the ecological basis of all civilization. Doesn't this remind us of something familiar? Are we not facing similar challenges today? Climate change, the depletion of natural resources, pollution. All these problems have deep historical roots, and the story of Mohenjo-Daro shows us that even the most advanced civilizations are not immune to ecological collapse unless they learn to live in harmony with nature. There is something almost mystical about the way ancient texts travel through the ages, changing their meaning, gaining new interpretations, like ancient bottles washed ashore by the sea. Each era reads something different in them. And when, in the 20th century, mankind first split the atom and saw the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima, it is not surprising that we began to look for echoes of that horror in ancient sources. Imagine yourself as a researcher in the 1950s, living in a world where nuclear war has suddenly turned from science fiction into a real threat. The Cold War is gaining momentum. The news is full of reports of atomic tests, and the air is saturated with fear of invisible radiation. And so in this atmosphere, you open an ancient text and read a description of a weapon that burns without fire and causes people's hair to fall out. Isn't it natural to see this as a description of what our generation has witnessed? This is probably how the legend of nuclear war in antiquity was born. The authors of The Morning of the Magicians, Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier, were not malicious falsifiers. They were men of their time, fascinated by the mysteries of the past and amused by the technical achievements of the present. They genuinely believed they had found echoes of forgotten knowledge in ancient texts, and their enthusiasm was so infectious that it spawned a whole trend in popular literature. But myths, as we know, have a life of their own. They are not particularly interested in facts. It is more important for them to fulfill our deepest fears and hopes. And the myth of the ancient nuclear war met several needs of the human psyche at once. It provided a simple explanation for mysterious archaeological findings, confirmed our belief in the cyclical nature of history, and at the same time flattered our technological conceit. After all, think about it. If the ancients already knew how to split the atom, it turns out that we are not pioneers in this field, but only rediscover the forgotten truths. This simultaneously humbles our pride and elevates us. We become heirs of great ancestors, restoring the lost wisdom. The legends of Vimanas, ancient flying machines, feed from the same source. In an age when mankind dreamed of conquering the sky, and then space, how tantalizing to discover that our ancestors were already flying between the stars. Sanskrit texts do indeed mention the chariots of the gods, and some of these descriptions are amazing in their detail. But here, we face the same problem as with nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata. When an ancient author describes a Vimana as a double-decked round flying machine with holes and a dome, we must remember that he is writing a poetic work, not a technical manual. His task is not to convey precise constructional details, but to create an image that will strike the imagination of his listeners. In addition, many of the most detailed descriptions of Vimanas are found in texts that were written down or substantially revised well into modern times, when Indian culture was influenced by Greek, Persian, and later Islamic traditions. Some of the technical details may have emerged as a result of familiarity with the achievements of other civilizations, such as Greek mechanical devices or Arabic alchemical treatises. Take, for example, the references to Vimana Mercury engines. Mercury did play an important role in ancient alchemy. This mysterious metal, which remains liquid at room temperature, was believed to have special properties. Alchemists of all cultures experimented with mercury, trying to use it to obtain gold or the elixir of immortality. Not surprisingly, mercury has also taken pride of place as a miracle engine in descriptions of fantastic machines. As for the yellow-white liquid, which allegedly served as fuel for Vimana, and which some enthusiasts compare with petrol, here, most likely, we are talking about some ritual liquid, perhaps ghee oil, which was used in sacred fires, or soma, a mysterious drink of the gods, the recipe for which was lost in antiquity. But the most interesting thing about these ancient descriptions is not their possible technical accuracy, but what they tell us about the dreams and aspirations of people of the distant past. The ancient Indians dreamed of flight, just as the Greeks dreamed of flight when they told the story of Icarus, or the Chinese when they created the legends of Chang'e, who flew to the moon. The desire to go to the sky, to overcome the Earth's gravity, is one of the most universal human dreams. And in this sense, Vimanas are not a technical achievement of antiquity, but a symbol of the invincible human aspiration for freedom, for overcoming limitations. When the ancient poet described the gods flying across the sky in their chariots, he was expressing the same dream that, millennia later, led the Wright brothers to the sand dunes of Kitty Hawk and inspired Gagarin to fly into space. There is another aspect of this story that is important to remember. When we talk about ancient civilizations, we sometimes forget that the people of the past were no less intelligent and inventive than we are. They just lived in different conditions and solved different problems. The people of Mohenjo-Daro, for example, created a system of urban planning that in many ways surpasses what we see in modern cities in the developing world. Their sewerage system was so advanced that each house had its own toilet and bathroom, a luxury not even 18th century European capitals knew. They invented a standardized system of weights and measures that was used over a vast area from Afghanistan to Gujarat. Their jewelers created ornaments of such fine workmanship that modern craftsmen can hardly reproduce some of the techniques. Their engineers built docks and harbors, the remnants of which are still strikingly elaborate today. But the most amazing thing is the society they created. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, where archaeologists find luxurious tombs of pharaohs and kings, there are no obvious signs of social inequality in the cities of the Indus civilization. Houses vary in size, but not dramatically. There are no grand palaces, no monumental temples, and no rich burials. It seems that this was a society where power and wealth were distributed relatively evenly, perhaps governed by a council of elders or some form of democracy. If so, the Indus Valley people were millennia ahead of the Greeks in the invention of democratic institutions. Of course, we can only guess about the social structure of the Harappan civilization, as their writing has not yet been deciphered. And this is one of the great mysteries of archaeology. We know that they had a written language. Archaeologists have found thousands of seals and tablets with inscriptions. But despite the efforts of many scientists, these texts remain mute to us. Imagine, we have letters, documents, perhaps even literary works from 4,000 years ago in front of us, and we cannot read a single word. It is as if you found an ancient library, but all the books in it are written in a completely unknown language. The problem is that the Harappan script does not resemble any of the ancient writing systems we know of. It is not related to cuneiform writing. It is not related to Egyptian hieroglyphics. It has nothing to do with Chinese characters. It is a completely independent invention. And we have no Rosetta Stone to help us find the key to deciphering it. Some scholars even doubt that this is writing in the usual sense of the word. Perhaps it is some kind of symbol system intended for other purposes. For example, for trade calculations or ritual rites. But most researchers are still inclined to believe that this is a real writing. But we just can't read it yet. And here again is the amazing irony of history. We live in an age when we can decode the human genome, launch a probe to Pluto, and create artificial intelligence. But we cannot read letters written by our ancestors 4,000 years ago. Technological progress does not always mean progress in understanding the past. Moreover, the more we learn about ancient civilizations, the more mysteries arise before us. Each new discovery by archaeologists forces us to reconsider how humanity developed. It turns out that people learnt navigation much earlier than we thought, that they were building sophisticated astronomical instruments millennia before Copernicus, that they possessed technologies whose principles we do not fully understand. But recognizing these facts does not mean that we should look for nuclear reactors or spaceships in the past. On the contrary, the more we learn about the real achievements of the ancients, the clearer we realize that human genius is capable of incredible achievements, even with the most modest technical means. The builders of Mohenjo-Daro did not need atomic energy to create one of the greatest cities of antiquity. They had enough clay, wood, copper, and, most importantly, human intelligence and hard work. Their engineers did not know electricity, but created a water system that worked perfectly. Their architects did not use computer programs, but planned the city with such precision that its streets still serve as a model of urban planning. And therein, perhaps, lies the main lesson of the Mohenjo-Daro story. It is not that the ancients possessed super technology, but that human genius does not depend on the level of technical development. In any era, there are people who can rise above the everyday and create something great. But there is another lesson about the fragility of civilization. Mohenjo-Daro flourished for almost 1,000 years and then disappeared. Its people were no dumber than we are. their society no less advanced. But they couldn't solve the environmental problems they created. They could not find a balance between the needs of a growing city and the limited resources of the environment. And as we face similar challenges today, climate change, dwindling natural resources, pollution, the story of Mohenjo-Daro reminds us that even the most advanced civilizations are not immune to collapse unless they learn to live in harmony with nature. You know, there is a special magic in the ruins of ancient cities. When you walk along the streets where people walked 4,000 years ago, when you touch the walls that remember the voices and laughter of generations long gone, time seems to roll up in a tube, and the past becomes tangible. And at that moment, you realize that history is not a set of facts in a textbook, but a living river that flows through the centuries, connecting us with those who lived before us and with those who will live after. Mohenjo-Daro is now an open-air museum in Pakistan's Sindh province. Tourists come here to look at the ancient ruins, to be photographed against the backdrop of brick walls, and to listen to the guides' stories about the mysterious civilization. But few of them think that these ruins are not just a monument to the past, but a mirror in which our own time is reflected. Imagine an archaeologist of the future who in 4,000 years will be digging up the ruins of our cities. What will he find? Concrete jungles of megacities, plastic waste in geological layers, traces of radioactive contamination from our nuclear power plants? And what legends will his contemporaries tell about us? Maybe they will also argue about whether we possessed any super technologies, or on the contrary, bewildered as to how we managed to pollute the planet so much with such a high level of scientific knowledge. History likes to repeat itself, but not literally, but rather as a musical theme with variations. The basic motifs remain the same: the desire for prosperity, the struggle for resources, attempts to find a balance between human needs and the possibilities of nature. But each era plays this theme in its own tone, with its own instruments, at its own pace. The people of Mohenjo-Daro thought their city would stand forever. They invested enormous effort in its construction, planned its development for decades to come, and built an infrastructure that would last for centuries to come. They could not have imagined that their beautiful city would one day become a pile of ruins, and their civilization would become nothing more than the subject of archaeologists' arguments. That's exactly what we think. Our cities seem eternal, our civilization immutable, our technology omnipotent. We build skyscrapers that should stand for centuries, create works of art for future generations, lay parks and gardens that will please our descendants. And it is right. A man should build for centuries, think in terms of eternity. But the history of Mohenjo-Daro reminds us that eternity is a relative concept, and each generation must win the right to the future anew. What destroyed the great Indus Valley civilization? We have talked about environmental causes, deforestation, climate change, droughts, and floods. But perhaps there were other factors as well. Perhaps society gradually lost the qualities that once made it great: the ability to innovate, the ability to solve complex problems, the willingness to make sacrifices for the common good. Archaeologists note that in the later periods of Mohenjo-Daro's existence, the quality of life in the city gradually deteriorated. The houses were built less carefully, the sewerage system was not working as well, and the quality of handicrafts was declining. It seems that the society was losing the skills and knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries. Why does this happen? Why do civilizations sometimes seem to forget what they once knew? Perhaps it is because knowledge and skills are transmitted not only through books and instructions, but also through a living tradition, through an unbroken chain of teacher-student. When this chain is broken, because of wars, epidemics, social upheavals, or simply because the younger generation loses interest in the experience of their ancestors, knowledge begins to disappear. In our era, we feel this problem particularly acutely. On the one hand, we have created information storage and transmission systems unprecedented in history. All human knowledge can be stored on the hard disk of a computer. Any book can be downloaded from the internet. Any fact can be found on a search engine. But on the other hand, we are increasingly dependent on technologies that are understood only by a narrow circle of specialists. If electricity disappeared tomorrow, how many of us would be able to build a house, grow a crop, cure a disease? We store our knowledge digitally, but digital media are fragile and short-lived. In 100 years, our DVDs and thumb drives will turn to dust, and cloud servers will rust. What will be left of our civilization if there is no electricity to power computers? The inhabitants of Mohenjo-Daro wrote on clay tablets that have been in the ground for 4 millennia and have survived in almost pristine condition. Of course, we can't read them, but the material itself is perfectly preserved. But try reading a 20-year-old floppy disk or a file written in a forgotten format. It is often more difficult than deciphering ancient hieroglyphics. But let's not fall into technological pessimism. Our civilization has one huge advantage over all previous civilizations. We know about their existence. We study their achievements and mistakes. We can learn from their experience. The inhabitants of Mohenjo-Daro did not know about the fate of Atlantis, if it existed at all. The Egyptians at the time of pyramid building did not suspect the existence of Sumer. And the Greeks of the classical period knew almost nothing about the Mycenaean civilization. We live in a unique epoch. For the first time in human history, we can see the whole picture, from the first cave paintings to space flights. We can compare different civilizations, study the patterns of their development, look for common causes of prosperity and decline. And this gives us a chance, perhaps the only chance in history, to consciously choose our own path of development, taking into account the experience of the past. So what can we learn from the story of Mohenjo-Daro? The first lesson is the importance of ecological thinking. The Indus Valley civilization perished not because of external enemies or natural disasters, but because they exhausted the resources of their ecological niche. They cut down the forests, depleted the soils, disturbed the water balance of the region, and as a result, their thriving cities became a desert. Today, we face similar challenges, but on a global scale. Climate change, depletion of natural resources, pollution, all these are direct consequences of our impact on the planet. And the lesson of Mohenjo-Daro is that no amount of technological advances will save civilization unless it learns to live in harmony with nature. The second lesson is the importance of social cohesion. Archaeological evidence suggests that Mohenjo-Daro society was characterized by relative equality and the absence of sharp social conflicts. Perhaps this is what enabled them to achieve such a high level of development. But when the age of crises began, this same equality could have played a negative role. There were no strong leaders in the society capable of mobilizing resources to solve environmental problems. And here we see one of the eternal dilemmas of human society: how to combine equality with efficiency, democracy with strong leadership, stability with the ability to change. Each epoch solves these questions in its own way, and there is no single recipe. The third lesson is about the fragility of human memory. The Indus Valley civilization has existed for almost 1,000 years, longer than Christianity has existed, longer than it has existed from the time of Charlemagne to the present day. It created great cities, advanced culture, sophisticated technology, and all this disappeared so without a trace that we still can't read a single text of theirs, don't know a single name of their rulers, don't understand their religion and philosophy. It reminds us how important it is to preserve the memory of the past. It is not by chance that all great civilizations created monuments, pyramids, temples, statues, which were meant to convey to posterity the memory of their creators. It is not by chance that they developed writing systems, wrote down their laws, chronicles, poems. They understood that civilization is not only cities and technology, but also memory, cultural tradition, spiritual heritage. And finally, the fourth lesson is that behind every great mystery of the past are living people with their hopes, fears, and dreams. When we talk about Mohenjo-Daro, it is easy to forget that it was not just an archaeological site, but home to tens of thousands of people. Here, children were born, young people fell in love, old men told stories to their grandchildren. Craftsmen were proud of their skills. Traders dreamed of distant lands. Each of these people had their own history, their own joys and sorrows, their own plans for the future. They did not know that their city would go down in the history books as a mysterious civilization. They just lived, worked, loved, raised their children, hoped for the best. And in this, they were no different from us. Perhaps this is the main value of studying the past, not to find answers to all questions, but to feel this connection of time, this continuity of human experience. The people of Mohenjo-Daro looked at the same stars as we do, felt the same warmth of the sun, heard the same sound of rain. Their concerns were different, but their feelings were the same. And when we realize this, ancient history ceases to be a collection of facts and dates. It becomes a mirror in which we see ourselves, our possibilities and limitations, our achievements and mistakes, our hopes and fears. Mohenjo-Daro teaches us not that the ancients possessed nuclear weapons or flying machines, but that the human spirit in every age strives for beauty, for perfection, for harmony. These people created a city that still amazes us with its beauty and thoughtfulness. They invented technology that has served them well. They built a society where everyone had access to clean water and sanitation, a privilege still denied to billions of people on our planet. And if their civilization eventually perished, it was not because they were worse or more stupid than us. It's just that they, like us, were human beings, with all human weaknesses and limitations. They couldn't solve the problems they themselves created, but they tried. And there was something beautiful and heroic in that attempt. Today, as we face global challenges, climate change, resource depletion, social inequality, the experience of Mohenjo-Daro reminds us that we have a choice. We can repeat their mistakes, and then our cities, too, will become ruins to be studied by archaeologists of the future. Or we can learn from their experience and find a new path, the path to a civilization that can exist in harmony with nature and with itself. And you know what? I believe that we will choose the second path, because we are heirs not only of the mistakes of the past, but also of its wisdom. We are the descendants of those who built Mohenjo-Daro and the pyramids, who created great epics and philosophical systems, who reached America on small boats and traveled to the stars on rockets. We have the blood of explorers and builders, dreamers and inventors. And this ancient city in the Pakistani desert is a reminder of what human genius is capable of when it is directed towards creation rather than destruction. Time flows, and already late evening is creeping up to the windows. The wind is blowing outside the window. The lights of the night city are blinking somewhere in the distance. And in this silence, in this peace, you and I made a wonderful journey. We traveled back 4,500 years, walked the streets of an ancient city, heard the voices of people who have long been gone. And now, as our story comes to an end, I would like to say good night to you, dear listeners. May you dream not nightmares of nuclear war, but peaceful dreams of the cities of the future, where people live in harmony with each other and with nature, where rivers flow clean and the sky remains blue, where children play in the streets without fear of war or catastrophe. Good night. See you next time, when we will again go on a journey through the labyrinths of history, where every path leads to new discoveries, and every find tells us something important about ourselves. Sweet dreams, and may the stars that shone for the people of Mohenjo-Daro bring you wisdom and peace as well.